spoke to his disciples face to face, making that understanding of what God is even more profound. John, twice in his epistles, in 2 John and in the third epistle as well, John said, I have many things to say to you, but I don't want to do so with paper and ink. Now, he did use paper and ink, and we can be thankful for the fact that he, as an apostle, preserved his thoughts given by inspiration so that we in future generations can benefit from that. But he also saw the value of face-to-face relationship with those brethren, with that bride of Christ that he was so concerned about. And so he says, I want to come and speak to you face-to-face so that our joy may be full. And how much better it is, and how much richer our relationships are when we can be together face-to-face. Of course, the quality of those kind of encounters depends on our character. If we are evil, and that's what we bring to the relationship, we're not going to help either side of the equation. We're not going to help the other person, nor are they going to help us. Evil companions corrupt good morals. And as Proverbs 13 and 20 tells us, if we walk with wise men, we will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. And so, if we make poor choices about those personal and intimate relationships, it's going to haunt us. It's going to damage us. But I want us to consider this morning, as a vehicle of sharing these thoughts, that familiar Bible story of Jacob and Esau, and how several times in the course of the history of their tense and sometimes broken relationship, the term face-to-face comes to mind. And so thinking about those sections of Scripture that involve those men, we go back first of all to Abraham and the promise that God made to the patriarch that through your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. And not only that, the means to that ultimate end, the blessing in Jesus, was through a place, I give unto you the land of Canaan, and through a people, I'll make of you a great nation. And that promise to Abraham and his seed was repeated. It goes back to the plan God had in his mind before the foundation of the world. He had planned to save mankind through his Son. And when sin entered the world in Genesis chapter 3, and the curse was pronounced because of that transgression, there was a promise veiled in a curse that to the serpent who had beguiled Eve, there is the statement that God made in the garden that the Lord would put enmity between you and between the serpent and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head. You shall bruise him on the heel. Anticipates the spiritual struggle between Jesus Christ and Satan and the ultimate victory that Christ achieved in coming forth from the grave and breaking the bonds of death and dealing a death blow to the devil, ultimately to be realized when Christ comes back again. But as you go down through time and you think about the fulfillment of God's plan, it was one that was telescoping. It became ever more focused as we zoom into the future. So the promise made to Abraham was one that was realized through his descendants, Isaac and Jacob, and then ultimately the tribe of Judah, and then the lineage of David and Jesus Christ himself. And so that was God's telescoping plan, ever more specific and focused in its promises. But it was also conditioned. If you look at Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, we see that God's assessment of Abraham was such that he expected something out of Abraham. He had already seen faith, and he had every confidence that Abraham would continue to be a man of faith and would communicate that to future generations. And so, as God contemplates sharing with Abraham events that were about to unfold, the judgment that would fall on Sodom and Gomorrah, God says, I have chosen him, Genesis 18:19, that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. And so God chose Abraham, but with that there was an expectation. And there was a requirement that Abraham transmit his faith to his children and to his grandchildren. And so what we see then in the unfolding of God's plan is that occurs But as we think about how it unfolds, by the time we come to the story of Jacob and Esau, you deal with a situation where, like Abraham and Sarah previously, they had longed for a child, but the promise of a child had been long delayed. And so also with Isaac and Rebekah, it was 60 years old before Isaac had a son. And that son of promise, when he finally came, was an answer to a fervent prayer on the part of Rebekah. She conceived not one child, but twins. And as we read the prophecy made about those boys, Genesis 25 and 23, the text says, 2 nations are in your womb. Now you remember, they were struggling within her womb, and she said, if I am blessed, why am I thus? It's almost like she was saying, 2 nations are at war already, as the kids were kicking and squirming inside of her womb. But there's significance here that looks beyond the 2 individuals to the nations that would come from them. There are 2 peoples that will be separated from your body. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. God's sovereign purpose. People get confused about that. Bruce has been writing a series of articles on Romans 9 for Truth Magazine, of which I edit, and he contributes significantly. And he's done a very good job in that discussion. I commend, you know his quality of preaching, and you know his ability to deal with those kind of difficult texts. But what we see in this is that God's promise that he made to Abraham was very specific. It wasn't going to be fulfilled as Abraham might have dreamed up some solution. Eliezer of Damascus, he's my heir. Could he be the fulfillment? No, your son. Hagar, bright idea on the part of Sarah. I'll use a surrogate. That didn't work out, did it? That didn't create any degree of fulfillment of God's plans. And so it wasn't Eliezer of Damascus. It wasn't Ishmael, the son of Hagar. It was Isaac, the son of miraculous promise. Again, the next generation, moving down the line, God's plan and his purpose was not to be realized through the descendants of Esau, but rather through Jacob, the younger, as opposed to the older. The third generation, shifting to that. It's not the firstborn. It's not Reuben that God used as the vehicle through whom the Messiah would come. The 3 oldest sons of Israel disqualified themselves for various sins, but it was through Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah until Shiloh come. And so in all of this, what we understand is that when God made a choice about Jacob and Esau, and that's discussed in Romans 9 and sometimes often a subject of confusion and misunderstanding, he's not talking about the eternal salvation of either of the men when he says, Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. He's talking about the choice of peoples through whom the Messiah would come and the respective attitude he had toward the nations that flowed from those progenitors. And so we see then it's God's telescoping plan. But back to the story. That's a study of its own, but I just wanted to add that as a compliment to the work that I know that you're familiar with that Bruce has done. But as we go back to the story and we try to compress into the time that we have, and we recognize the limited amount of that, let's think about this concept of face-to-face coupled with alienation and reconciliation. We see that the boys were born, and Esau comes out first of the 2, and shortly thereafter, moments later, the second of the 2 twins were born, but he comes out grasping the heel of his brother, as we read in Genesis chapter 25 and verses 24 through 26. So the elder, Esau, will serve the younger and be subservient and ultimately of less significance in God's plans to both. The boys grow. Sadly, there is a problem in the home of favoritism, and we read of that as we see that the boys grew up, Genesis 25 and verse 27, and they had their respective personalities and likes and dislikes. Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. The sad thing about all of this is that Isaac loved Esau, and Rebekah loved Jacob. The mother and the father had their own favorites, and it showed. In the course of time, we see the character of these two boys showing through. And the Bible says in the book of Hebrews that Esau was a profane man. And I understand that to mean he did not value things of value. He made a repeated succession of bad choices of companions. Wives that he chose were Canaanite women, and they gave grief to his parents. But when it came to the promise, he was the oldest. He had both the blessing and the birthright, at least normally expected to flow to the firstborn. But the old boy comes in from the field one day, exhausted and famished, and he says, "I'm about to die. Brother, can you give me any of that good red meat and stew that you're serving?" And conniving Jacob says, "Sure, I'll make a deal with you. I'll give you something to eat if you will give me your birthright." He sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. And the text says that Esau despised his birthright. We are warned from that in Hebrews chapter 12, if you'll notice verses 14 through 15. We should pursue peace and sanctification, apart from which we cannot see God. And so we need to strive for peace with our brethren and peace with our God through being like God and sanctified. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble. And then the classic example of that is Esau. Esau, who was an immoral and godless man, who sold his birthright for a single meal. He didn't value things of value. By the same token, Jacob has his own set of problems. Jacob is a grasping man. That's the meaning of his name, heel catcher. He came out of the womb grabbing hold of his brother's heel, and that characterizes his life's approach. In this case, in a very carnal, selfish, and physical way. I want what I see, and I'm going to use whatever means necessary to get there. So the first expression, instead of just simply showing kindness to his brother and giving him a meal to satisfy his hunger, he treated the big dumb ox, or oaf, as he probably thought about an older brother who seems to not have a lot of sense and judgment. He conned him out of it. He robbed him of his birthright. Now, yeah, Esau agreed to it, but he was so short-sighted he didn't value things of value. Jacob, of course, took matters into his own hands and did so repeatedly, first in this matter of having to basically make this kind of one-sided deal with his brother, and secondly, when it came to the matter of the blessing at a much later point, when the word comes out that the father, who is old and aged, nearly blind and feeble, and is anticipating his death, is at the point of pronouncing the parental blessing upon the sons, we see that Isaac tells Esau, "Go out into the field, kill some game, cook a savory meal, bring it in, we'll eat, and then I will use that as an occasion to bless you." The blessing, highly significant. Rebekah gets wind of it, and she conspires with her son Jacob. "Let's get ahead of the game. I'll help you. You go get something from the flock. I'll cook it. You will engage in an act of deceit, and we will deceive my husband and your father for the sake of receiving the blessing that God had already promised. It's going to be his." But neither of them have faith enough to believe the promise and think they have to act deceitfully and to damage the relationship both shared with Isaac to achieve an end that they carnally wanted. And so that resulted then in some rather tragic circumstances. The result was an ominous threat. When daddy dies, you're next. You're a dead man. This is one brother speaking to his other. When my father passes away, we're going to have a double funeral. Just plan on it. And so, with that, and the context of what do we do next, Jacob was sent away to Padan Aram, where he was to choose a bride and stay until your brother settles down, until he forgets the wrong you've committed. It was a wrong that he committed. And so you go to see your family, choose a wife from among your kinsmen in Padan Aram, and then come back when everything's settled down. So that was the tragic consequence of sin. Sin always leads to alienation, certainly between man and God, but frequently in human affairs as well. It damages our relationship with one another. Along the way, Jacob encounters God. At least he has a vision. He has a dream as he journeys to a place called Luz, and there, having rushed away in haste and for fear of his life, he doesn't even bring a pillow and has a stone for a pillow and lays there, and in the night has a vision of the angels of God ascending and descending upon a ladder. And his conclusion from the end of that was, this is the very house of God. He renamed the place Bethel. And he built an altar to the Lord, and he made a promise to God. If you will see me through my journey safely and back, I will faithfully serve you, and I will be true to you. And in verse 16, we have this wonderful statement. Jacob awoke from his dream, Genesis chapter 28 and verse 16. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. Which is a sad testament to much of how he's lived his prior life. The promises that God made were certain and fixed, and yet he's lived all of his life up till this point thinking he has to do it on his own and conspire with deceit to accomplish his ends and with manipulation to achieve his goals, acting as if the promise God had made to his mother, to his parents, somehow didn't exist. He's always been acting as if God wasn't in this place. There's nothing new here, but now he comes to realize the omniscience, the omnipotence, and the omnipresence of God. God is always in this place, not just Bethel. He is always near if we will call upon him and trust him. And so he built an altar to honor God, and he made a vow and promised to give unto God a tenth of all his produce if God would see him through his journey. So he goes to Padan Aram. We're going to skip over that part of the story because that's a set of stories to itself. That could take a quarter in a Bible class series to think about the events of Jacob and Padan Aram and his wives, and one that he loved and one that he didn't, and others that he got as part of the mix and the mess that all created. But the years that followed, the 20 years that followed, were filled with a certain degree of happiness. The love he had for Rachel was so great that it was as if just a few days that he labored for her hand. And then he got conned into having 2 wives and then 2 handmaidens, and then from that, a passel of kids, 11 in all, 11 sons at least, when he comes back home, 12 total. But this is a time in which he meets his match. He's been a man that has been grasping and manipulative and has lived by his wits and wouldn't take a moment's hesitation to take advantage of someone else. And his father-in-law is just like him times 10. Laban is exactly the same kind of character who is a grasping man. And so the heel catcher meets his match. And yet God sees him through all of this. And though Laban changed his wages multiple times and tried to always win out, God's blessings was with Jacob, and he prospered and his family grew. And he, in his own halting way, continues to trust in God. After being there 20 years, he goes home, or at least he plans a trip home. And he journeys with his wife and his children and his handmaidens and his enormous wealth, and he travels back toward Canaan, which takes us to where we want to focus in what remains of our time. Returning to Canaan, Jacob has an unresolved problem. His brother is still there, and he's got to make this right in some way. He's got to make this a livable arrangement in some way. And so in Genesis chapter 32, we see his efforts to achieve that end. And so he confronts the failure of his past, and he seeks to restore his broken relationship with Jacob. And so verse 1 says, as Jacob went on his way, the angels of the Lord appeared to him. And Jacob saw them. When he saw them, he said, this is God's camp. And so he named that place Mahanaim. He sends messengers to his brother. He sends gifts of abundance and wealth. And he's trying to make this reunion as peaceable and as agreeable as possible. And down in verse 6, we learn that when the messengers returned, they come with word that Esau is coming to meet you with 400 men. And that sounds ominous. That sounds like the threat is about to be carried out. And so in his effort to try to avoid complete annihilation, he divides the people that were with him, verse 7, into groups, and the flocks and herds and camels into two companies. And he's trying to think ahead. If Esau attacks, at least maybe one of the two companies can escape. He divides his family up in almost, again, a favored status. Wives, the children of the handmaidens, the children of Leah, Rachel. Boy. And yet, before they have their encounter, there's an unexpected encounter that occurs that, to me, is the key part of this whole story. Let's read Genesis chapter 32 and in verse 24. Jacob was left alone. Genesis 32 and 24. Jacob was left alone, and he encounters someone identified first as a man. But it's clearly an angelic representative, and it's clearly one who speaks on behalf of God. And so this is one of those occasions where God interacts with the patriarchs, as God did with Abram at the oak of Mamre, when 3 men traveled across the plain, and Abraham showed hospitality. And then here we see the same thing occurs where there's a man that appears to Jacob. And they wrestled, they struggled all night. Jacob has sent his family across the brook. He's about to go, the last to cross, and yet he's hesitant, he's restricted, he's not able to cross over yet. They wrestled until daybreak. And when he saw, now this is, keep the pronouns straight in the reading of verse 25. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh, so that the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. The angel, the angelic being that we see here, or as Jacob refers to him, God, at least in form that man could interact with, Jacob prevails in this wrestling match. He will not let go of his adversary. The grasping man, the heel catcher, now is directing that innate aggressive type A personality. I've got something I want, and I'm not going to let go until I get it. That's been a part of his life, his entire existence, misdirected in his youth. Now spiritually directed towards seeking a blessing of God. And so I think that this, to me, is a profound moment of spiritual maturity on the part of Jacob, where in his second encounter with God, it's the first one, you help me and I'll be faithful to you. You know, it's almost a negotiating tit for tat kind of thing at Bethel. If you bless me and see me home, I will promise to be faithful to you. This one is more focused on seeking God's blessings and being unrelenting in that desire. And so Jacob, the heel catcher, will not let go of his adversary, this man whom he is wrestling with all night long, until the adversary uses supernatural power, touching the socket of his thigh, dislocating Jacob's thigh, resulting in a limp henceforth. He said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking," verse 26. This is the angelic representative, the divine representative speaking. But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And so he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but rather Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Now his zeal, now his aggressive personality, now his type A, get her done mentality is being properly focused. You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." And he says, "Why do you ask?" And he blessed him there. And so Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face." A face-to-face encounter of mortal man with the Almighty, or at least a representative of the Almighty as he reveals himself on this occasion. And then that leads us to really almost the anticlimactic reunion of the two boys. I think that's the high point of the story right there, the encounter, the wrestling match in the night. But the reunion was not at all what Jacob feared. Esau, amazingly, embraces his brother, weeps when he sees him. We read in verse 1, Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, with 400 men with him. And he divided his children among Leah and Rachel and the two handmaidens, and he put the handmaidens and their children in front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. I wonder how the kids felt about that grouping and what that signified. You just had to know they understood what this represents. And he himself passed over ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And look at the reunion. Look at the spiritual maturity that has now affected both boys. Men, I should say. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. How often problems can be solved if we will simply meet face to face and show a humble attitude in the process. If your brother hath aught against thee, leave your gift at the altar. Go be reconciled to your brother. If you have aught against your brother, approach it from exactly the same standpoint. Meet, talk, solve it. And that can be most easily accomplished face to face. What happens when we won't speak with each other? Usually those problems just get bigger, and the offenses of the past and the fear of the future and the reading into current actions that may be entirely innocent are made malicious and added with all sorts of layers of suspicion. But how often can we cut through all of that if we will just sit down with one another face to face and be reconciled? And so that's our lesson for this morning. I hope that this study has been useful as we can look at events from the Bible of people that were flawed as we are. I can look at my life and I can see times when I was just about as carnal-minded and as selfish as Jacob appears early in the story. I hope I've made some growth. And we certainly see with the person of Jacob, he grew over time. His personality remained the same through his life. Our personalities probably aren't going to change all that much. We can work on the edges and we can direct our temperament, but we work with what we've got. But let's direct our energies and who we are and what strengths and weaknesses we possess to a higher plane than maybe they are presently or where they were yesterday. And when that involves our interaction with our brethren, let's understand the value of not just allowing problems to just go on and never be solved and never addressed, but let's realize the benefit of face-to-face reconciliation in times in which alienation may have scarred our relationship. As we offer the invitation, song that has been selected, 319, was that the one that was said? Only a step. So if there's any this morning that need to respond to the gospel, if you are alienated from your Maker, not yet a child of God, you can solve that state by meeting your Maker in obedience and submitting to his will in the waters of baptism. And if you're alienated from your family, you can solve that problem by talking to the one with whom you're estranged. And if you're alienated with your brethren, and that has to do with actions that are known by all, make it right in such a way that all know the change of heart that has occurred. And will you not come and take that step as we stand and as we sing?